Good evening, everybody. I'm Paul Johnson. I'm Director of the IFS. All I'm going to do is very briefly introduce our speaker and welcome all of you. So thank you so much for coming to this, the IFS 2024 Annual Lecture. We are really delighted once again to welcome one of the leading researchers in economics of public policy, something we've been doing for about 40 years now at these annual lectures, where we bring to this audience and the wider audience through streaming some of the best, most up-to-date thinking in the economics of public policy from some of the world's leading practitioners and researchers. So it's particularly wonderful to have today here Heidi Williams, who is going to talk about broadly speaking, the budget, as it says there, the budgetary impact of productivity policies. Something which is has been of remarkable political interest in the UK in recent years, as you hear politicians saying, we want the Office of Budget Responsibility to show what a big impact our policies are going to have on the public finances, and therefore we can do, broadly speaking, whatever we want, which I don't think is going to be the conclusion of Heidi's talk. Heidi is Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College in the US, and I think has devoted most of her career to looking at exactly what it is in research and innovation and so on that can really have an impact on productivity. I'm not going to go through her extraordinary CV. I've got in front of me just the longest imaginable list of affiliations that she has with some of the top economic research institutions and networks in the world. But rather than run through all of them, I'll just tell you that she is absolutely at the forefront of this work, both academically and in terms of policy. Heidi's going to speak for about 50 minutes. There will then be about 40 minutes for questions from the floor. So it's very kind of her to agree to that much interaction from all of you and that much of a quizzing, which I'm sure you will give her afterwards. So with no further ado, Heidi, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm very grateful to have a chance to share some of my work with you today. In my view, the field of economics provides a natural language and toolkit for tackling fundamental questions about how best to design public policies, such as encouraging economic growth. But when we have debates over the costs and benefits of policy changes, they don't simply center on the economic impacts of those changes. For example, which policy levers are most effective at stimulating economic growth. Rather, those debates also focus on the budgetary impacts of those policies in terms of how different policies are financed and how the enactment of different policies would impact government outlays and revenues. Particularly in the US, people look at the yawning gap between outlays and revenues that are projected under current law, and to some extent, it's never felt like accurate estimates of the budgetary impacts of policies have been more relevant to the discussion. Unfortunately, for reasons that I'm going to discuss, in some cases the policy process, perhaps inadvertently, relies on budgetary estimates of the effects of policy changes that starkly differ from the actual budgetary effects, in ways that, to me as a researcher, I'm concerned might mislead policymakers about what we've learned about the impacts of those policy changes. So rather than describe that disconnect at an abstract level, I'm going to instead start by illustrating that misalignment between estimated and actual budgetary impacts in the context of a specific example, which is policy changes affecting the number of highly skilled immigrants. Against the backdrop of that example, I'm then going to more precisely articulate the underlying question, which to preview is how and when to apply what's known as dynamic scoring. I'm then going to illustrate that disconnect between estimated and actual budgetary effects with two other examples more briefly. One is government-funded research and development investments, and the other is permitting regulations governing the construction of physical infrastructure investments. So let me share a few prefatory remarks before I dive into what I wanted to share with you today. First, I want to state very clearly that the three examples that I chose, high-skilled immigration, R&D, and permitting regulations, are meant to illustrate the quantitative magnitudes of what I'm talking about and to illustrate budgetary estimates under feasible alternative estimation approaches. What they are not meant to do is to communicate a policy position or a normative view that I hold on these issues. Indeed, in my opinion, normative views are often counterproductive in discussions about what rules and processes are most effective in producing and incorporating accurate budgetary estimates into the policy process. And at least in the US context, I think that's kind of why discussions about dynamic scoring have not been as productive as I might have hoped. So I'm discussing these examples from my perspective as a researcher. I care about the evidence that we as researchers have generated on the expected budgetary effects of policy changes being communicated accurately to policymakers. As a researcher, I'm concerned that at the moment there are some important cases where the rules and precedents that govern kind of the arcane details of the budgetary process, at least in the United States, are directing incomplete and non-comprehensive estimates to be reported to policymakers. Second, I'm somewhat painfully aware that many people find budget analysis to be somewhat arcane and technical and complicated and, God forbid, not even very interesting. For reasons that I hope will become clear during the course of my talk, I find this disconnect between actual and estimated budgetary impacts to be critically important. And I will just say up front that I appreciate your patience in giving me a few minutes to unpack the technical details, because I think the details are important in understanding the problem and to kind of try to put together an understanding of how important it is, how consequential it is, and what we might think about as feasible alternative approaches. And third, I appreciate your patience as I speak on the version of this topic that I know best, which is, a largely US-focused set of remarks on the work of the Congressional Budget Office and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, so the CBO and the JCT. As I will highlight at a few places during my talk, I think the conceptual issues are very relevant in the UK context, and I very much appreciate that. Actually, I visited the Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, yesterday, and really enjoyed the opportunity to interact with the staff there and talk with them about this work in more detail, and learned a lot from talking with them. But I do apologize that my remarks will be somewhat US focused. And then just to be very technically correct in what I'm saying and to avoid any confusion, there's one phrasing that I'm going to use that's somewhat non-traditional in the US context. So the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, is traditionally doing what are called cost estimates of legislative proposals, because CBO generally has responsibility for talking about the budgetary impacts of spending programs. The staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation generally handles taxation, and so they produce what are called revenue estimates. And so those terms of costs and revenue estimates are slightly misleading, because actually the Congressional Budget Office produces revenue estimates completely independent from the JCT in cases where those revenues are generated by channels other than legislative changes to the tax code. And so the reason that I want to use the phrase budgetary estimates is because I think it's more appropriate for the comprehensive nature of the numbers that the Congressional Budget Office reports. And in many ways, actually, the language that we use kind of is going to reflect the problem that I'm going to come back to during the course of the talk. Finally, even though I'm sharing these remarks in my personal capacity, I would be remiss not to thank my collaborators and teachers on the work that I'm going to discuss today. So my career as an academic researcher is focused on what I think of as the economics of innovation, trying to understand how policy design shapes the rate and direction of research, innovation, and productivity growth. Until about a year and a half ago, I had essentially never thought about the budgetary impacts of innovation and productivity policies. But I'm here talking with you about that topic today because I have become convinced that that topic is important, that for many reasons it's been neglected, and that it's an area where objective data and economic analysis can provide meaningful information to policymakers and to the public about the implications of seemingly technical methodological decisions in this area. So I'm very grateful, in particular, to many of the current and former staff of the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, as well as of the UK's OBR, who have been willing to spend time teaching me a lot of things that are hard to understand and hard to know simply from publicly available documents. And I especially want to thank Doug Elmendorf, one of the former Congressional Budget Office directors, who's been my close collaborator on much of the work that I'm going to present today. All right. So several years ago, I wrote a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives with Nick Bloom from Stanford and John Van Reenen from the LSE, who I know are two very well-known people to everyone here. And what we aimed to do there was to take stock of what we as economic researchers had learned about which policies appear to be most effective at encouraging innovation and productivity growth. So at the time, my own research had been largely focused on the patent system. But in the course of writing that piece, it became clear that one of the main conclusions that can be drawn from the academic literature in this area is that policy changes that admit more highly skilled immigrants to a country like the US appear to meaningfully increase the rate of innovation. So if we cut to today, both the US and the UK are experiencing a surge in immigration. I'm showing here the Congressional Budget Office's projections of the US labor force relative to the dashed line previous projections. So CBO's projections suggest that relative to this time last year, the size of the US labor force has increased by about 5.2 million people, with most of that increase resulting from higher projected net immigration. CBO estimates that this increase in net immigration primarily reflects an increase in a category that's specific to CBO that they term other foreign nationals, a category which includes individuals on humanitarian visas, individuals overstaying their visas, including student visas, and individuals entering the US without inspection, which includes a number of people entering the country illegally. Interestingly, despite EU net migration turning negative under the new post-Brexit immigration regime, the UK has seen its own total net migration increase substantially as well. So I enjoyed reading OBR's Economic and Fiscal Outlook, which noted the increase in net migration to the UK, in their estimation, was mainly driven by humanitarian visas, by international students, and dependents. And they also noted in particular that visas for health and care workers have shown a substantial increase, growing about 150% in the last year. So like CBO, OBR estimates a substantial increase in the labor force from those additional immigrants, as OBR assumes that migrants have the same labor market participation rate, as the UK resident population. So those figures for both the US and the UK refer to changes in net immigration in general, but as I mentioned, my particular interest here is in high-skilled immigration. So in the US case, we have less good data than you do in the UK, and data limitations make it surprisingly difficult to estimate what share of the current surge of immigrants in the US are comprised of highly skilled workers. As one example, when we talk about visa overstays among people on anything other than tourist visas, the largest group of suspected visa overstays are students. But in both the US and the UK, international students are likely to stay in country for longer in recent years. In the US because of optional practical training, or OPT, and in the UK because of the new graduate visa route. So students completing a degree in the US on an F1 student visa receive 12 months of work authorization by default. And likewise, students completing degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM fields, receive 3 years of work authorization by default. In my understanding, it's unclear whether those extensions are being accounted for in the Department of Homeland Security data that people use to measure visa overstays in the US, because we generally do a pretty poor job of tracking when people overstay their initial visa. When in fact, for students working on OPT, they would be fully legal in the US and kind of shouldn't be in this other foreign national category that CBO has them in. To the extent that some or all of those students are being categorized as visa overstays, that would result in a non-negligible share of the immigration surge, in fact being students who are STEM majors who are likely fully work authorized and employed in technical fields immediately post-graduation. As a second example, a number of data sets suggest that humanitarian visas to individuals, for example from Ukraine, are supporting the migration of a group that is on average very highly educated. So administrative data collected by the OECD for several European countries who received refugee inflows in 2022, averaged across sources and countries weighted by the sample size, estimated that 54% of Ukrainian refugees had at least a college degree. Similarly, a survey from Germany estimated 7% doctorates in that population, and a UN survey estimated 51% master's degrees and 3% doctorates. Research by Ina Ganguly and Fabian Waldinger are studying Ukrainian scientist refugees in particular, which is work that builds on actually quite a large economic history literature that has looked at the selection and number of who immigrates to countries like the US and the UK during times of war and crisis. And that literature has generally suggested that countries like the US get the best and brightest in terms of those immigrants. So just to cite one example, George Borjas and Kirk Duran have some work on Soviet mathematicians who outmigrated with the fall of the Soviet Union. And Just to read in their own words, the Soviet immigrants originated in the upper tail of the skill distribution of mathematicians in the Soviet Union and quickly moved into the upper tail of the skill distribution in the American mathematics community. They go on to say, presaging an idea I'll discuss more in a moment, the positive selection of the emigre sample therefore raises a strong possibility that they would generate beneficial productivity spillovers after their move to the United States. All right. So this is an expert, which you don't need to be able to read. I just wanted to point to the box so that if you want to read more, you can go to box 2-1 of CBO's 2024 Budget and Economic Outlook, which estimated that roughly 2% of the surge of US immigration is highly skilled STEM workers. Well, that's a small percent, given the total size of the surge. That is nonetheless a relatively large absolute number of highly skilled immigrants, several 100,000, larger than the current annual statutory cap on H-1B visas in the United States. CBO estimated that those individuals are likely to contribute to innovation-related activities in the US economy that are expected to boost total factor productivity, or TFP, causing TFP to be roughly 0.2% greater by the end of the 10-year budget window than it would have been otherwise. So given the central role of TFP as a driver of economic growth, that accumulates to actually quite a substantial effect on GDP during the first decade of their presence here. Much more straightforward to estimate than the share of STEM skilled immigrants or their productivity effects in the economy are simply the outlay and revenue consequences of additional immigrants moving to the US or the UK. So the main outlays in the US context are outlays on federally funded benefits like government subsidized healthcare through Medicaid or Affordable Care Act subsidies. And on the revenue side, the main drivers are payroll and income tax revenues. So this is a cover from a National Academies report from 2017 in the United States, which reviewed various sources of evidence on the fiscal consequences of highly skilled immigrants and their families moving to the United States, which concluded that on average, highly skilled immigrants contribute hundreds of thousands of dollars more in tax revenues than they receive in benefits. Consistent with the conclusions of that report, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the current immigration surge in the US increased tax revenues by about $1 trillion. Although as noted in the CBO Director's statement on the 2024 Budget and Economic Outlook, CBO is actively continuing to assess the implications of the immigration surge for both revenues and outlays. You can imagine that that's tricky, partly because people are coming in through these new pathways and their benefit eligibility and kind of work authorization status are just new for CBO to be modeling. So taken together, what I mean to communicate here is that both the academic literature and CBO's own work paint a picture in which the fiscal consequences of the current US surge in immigration is net deficit decreasing. Given that highly skilled immigrants generally accrue smaller outlays in terms of spending on federal benefits, and as relatively highly skilled workers contribute larger amounts in terms of payroll and income tax revenues, as well as likely contributing more to any innovation-related productivity activities in the economy, the fiscal consequences of policy changes that increase the number of highly skilled foreign nationals in the United States would thus be expected to be even more clearly net deficit decreasing. So against that background, let me share what was, at least to me, a very surprising fact that I learned about a year and a half ago. Budgetary estimates for proposals that increase the number of highly skilled immigrants to the US have generally been estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to result in a net cost to the federal budget. As an example, the mostly illegible snapshot that I included here is from one of CBO's budgetary estimates of a provision called 8303 of the America Competes Act, which has been included in different pieces of legislation over time, but essentially tries to lift country-specific caps on green cards for foreign national advanced degree holders in STEM fields. So that provision was estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to cost the US federal government $3.1 billion over 10 years. So hence the question that I would like to bring to frame my talk. How can the Congressional Budget Office be reporting a budgetary estimate that is so at odds, not just with the evidence from the research literature, but also with CBO's own baseline estimates of the budgetary and economic impacts of highly skilled immigrants? I remember when I first learned about this issue from someone who was closely following US legislative efforts related to high skilled immigration, I thought that they must have been mistaken. I'm a big fan of CBO's work, and I have a lot of confidence that they read the literature and they do an excellent job of estimating things. And so I thought this person must not know what they were talking about. But indeed, when I went to the CBO website, I found the relevant budgetary estimate, and it exactly matched this person's description. So as I'll explain, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation didn't make a mistake with that estimate. They simply followed procedures that were specified by the US Congress, but those procedures did not serve Congress well, in my opinion, in this case. Let me also say that it's a testament to the Congressional Budget Office's transparency that as an economist who knew literally nothing about budget scoring, I was able to comb through all of their beautifully transparent, publicly disclosed reports and trace out the exact history of how CBO has generated budgetary estimates of the impacts of various immigration-related provisions over time, which formed the basis for my research in this area, and which I hope will provide the basis for more informed discussion of the relevant methodological issues underlying CBO's budgetary estimates for immigration-related provisions going forward. So a question that many people have at this point is, does this really matter? And I want to say emphatically yes. 2 of the 3 reasons that I'll give are somewhat specific to the US context, and I hope you'll be patient with me on those. But the 3rd one I think is very relevant in the United Kingdom. So first, as I will describe, the rules set by Congress are directing CBO to report fundamentally mismeasured estimates of the budgetary impacts of highly skilled immigrants. And in my view, that matters directly because it means that political debates over legislative proposals are relying on incomplete and arguably just incorrect information. Second, from a historical perspective, CBO's estimates in the sense of the specific numbers that get reported, like that 3.1 billion number that I mentioned, matter more sharply now than ever due to the fact that in recent years, the US Congress has been increasingly relying on the heavily rules-based reconciliation process. So I realize that the phrase reconciliation process is inside baseball, even among people in Washington, D.C. policy circles. And all I mean to communicate with that phrase is that CBO's estimates matter more than ever in a way that I think actually makes some people uncomfortable because I'm not sure the estimates were ever intended to be used in the way that they are in the US political process. But the specific numbers really matter. Finally, and in my view most importantly, the Congressional Budget Office scores matter indirectly in a much larger sense, which is in terms of the incentives that they provide for policy development efforts. And this is where I think the analog to the UK holds very strongly. So because many types of requests and proposals considered by policymakers are subject to very specific budgetary rules and procedural rules, changes in the estimated budgetary impacts of a given proposal can affect what types of requests and proposals are made of politicians in the future. So to give one example, there was a provision in something called the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which in the US is sort of a must-pass bill, a defense funding bill. Each agency under the Department of Defense was able to request a number of green cards for fulfilling defense workforce needs, which were green cards for foreign national advanced degree holders in STEM fields. That provision was removed from congressional consideration due to complications stemming from the CBO score, that negative $3.1 billion number that it received from the Congressional Budget Office. So the technical footnote here for anyone who's interested is that for procedural reasons, NDAA provisions not strictly related to defense have to be deficit neutral up to $500,000. And so if you get a number back that's more than $500,000, such as $3.1 billion, that's going to get dropped out of the congressional debate. So I would see it as uncontroversial to assert that we would prefer to have accurate budgetary estimates shared with politicians, in part to play a role in a virtuous cycle, where policies that are designed to be more effective in achieving a given legislative goal at any given budgetary costs are appropriately given credit in the budgetary process, which would presumably incentivize the development of more such policy proposals in the future. So let me take a step back now to discuss the relevant underlying issues at a more abstract level rather than in the context of the immigration case. So dating back at least to the work of Robert Solow in 1957, productivity has been understood to be the key driver of long-run economic growth and human welfare. Reflecting that understanding, a central goal of many policymakers is investing in improving productivity. Of course, that's a funny goal given that we measure productivity as a residual of residual variation in output that can't be explained by observable inputs such as labor and capital. But for researchers like me, and I know at least many of you here, That narrative prioritizes the intellectual project of unpacking the black box of what drives productivity growth. And in my view, that is as challenging as it is important. But while we as researchers have a lot that we still need to learn, I think we've actually just made exceptional progress over the past few decades in understanding what types of policy changes, for example, changes in R&D investments, tax policy, patent policy, high-skilled immigration, labor market policy, and competition policy, would be expected to boost economic growth by spurring total factor productivity growth or employment. Economists have unfortunately focused much less attention on understanding the budgetary impacts of innovation and productivity policies. So as one illustration, consider the fact that I described that the Congressional Budget Office scores are generally estimated to be a net cost to the US federal budget when we admit more highly skilled immigrants. When I first learned that fact and was very confused, I asked basically every economist that I knew that worked on immigration, did you know that? Have you ever read any of CBO's cost estimates? I could not find any academic economist that had ever read any of CBO's estimates of legislative provisions related to immigration. And so in my experience, that's representative of a much more general neglect that we as economists have had of budget analysis as part of what we teach our students as being important if they're doing or want to be doing public policy relevant research. So when the US Congress receives budgetary estimates of how a policy proposal would affect the federal budget, they ask for that estimate from the Congressional Budget Office and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. As I mentioned at the beginning, CBO generally provides spending estimates and JCT generally provides revenue estimates. So conventional, or static scoring as it's sometimes called, but I prefer to use the phrase conventional. Conventional budgetary estimates account for mechanical effects, such as subsidizing flu vaccines, increase government spending as a price subsidy would. But they also include many kinds of behavioral responses, which is why I don't like using the word static, because I think static can often make people think you're not incorporating any behavioral margins, which is not true. So for example, the behavioral response that lower flu vaccine prices might encourage more people to get vaccinated, that response is included in a conventional budgetary estimate. What conventional budgetary estimates do not include is how a policy could affect employment, growth, and productivity in the macroeconomy. In other words, conventional budgetary estimates take the size of the economy as fixed at the baseline projection, rather than allowing the size of the economy to grow with policy changes that are intended to spur economic growth. Those types of growth effects are included in so-called dynamic budgetary estimates, but not in conventional budgetary estimates. Because conventional budgetary estimates hold the US population fixed at the baseline projection, conventional scores don't capture the mechanical increase in the US population that arises when additional immigrants come to the United States. From an implementation perspective, conventional budgetary estimates account for the costs of federal benefits that those immigrants might take up, that they're eligible for after they arrive here, but they do not account for the income and payroll tax revenues that would accrue to the federal budget. The consequence is that essentially any immigration proposal would be estimated under conventional methods to be deficit increasing. Under current practice, dynamic budgetary estimates are rarely reported in the US by the US Congressional Budget Office, not just for immigration, but more generally. And I want to be very clear, CBO regularly conducts dynamic analysis. For example, the budget and economic outlook that I presented is based on a fully dynamic analysis that's incorporated in all of their baseline projections. However, dynamic analyses are rarely included in the budgetary estimate CBO reports for specific legislative proposals. So the distinction is essentially the baseline projections are fully dynamic, but they're not attempting to attribute any of that to specific policy changes, whereas budgetary estimates of specific legislative provisions provide policymakers with much more concrete information about how specific policies would impact those budgetary and economic outcomes. So what that means is that when policymakers look for information on how policies that directly aim to spur productivity growth, like government-funded R&D investments, would affect the federal budget, the budgetary estimates that they receive do not take into account any of the potential productivity effects that those policies are, at least by construction, designed to spur. And that matters because conventional and dynamic budgetary estimates can be quite different. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, conservative lawmakers have argued for a long time that tax cuts could increase economic activity and spur economic growth, effects that are not included in conventional budgetary estimates and that could make tax cuts, in theory, less costly for the government. So public debate over dynamic scoring largely focused on that tax example, but of course many non-tax policies also have potential effects on total population, employment, income, and productivity. So in most cases, conventional and dynamic estimates are going to be very similar. But in cases where they differ, credible dynamic estimates are going to be more comprehensive and more accurate, and therefore more informative for lawmakers. So then you might have the question, why don't we always use dynamic analysis? And there's two arguments that have generally been made, which are important because I'm going to come back to at the end that I think these are arguments that were made for a long time and that we actually haven't updated kind of our views on how much of a problem these are currently. So first, modeling the impacts of legislative proposals on macroeconomic outcomes requires substantially more staff time and resources from places like CBO, JCT, and OBR, which are responsible for, at least in the US, delivering thousands of formal and informal cost estimates or budgetary estimates each year. So applying dynamic analyses to all of those formal and informal budgetary estimates on the time horizons demanded by the congressional process is essentially impossible. Second, the research literature doesn't always provide clear guidance on the sign or the magnitude of the relevant budgetary and economic effects. That lack of clear evidence is also a challenge even for conventional estimates, but many have argued that issue is more acute for macroeconomic outcomes. So recognizing those trade-offs, former CBO director Doug Elmendorf argued in a 2015 paper that he wrote for the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity shortly after he left CBO, that dynamic scoring should be applied to what's called major legislation, defined roughly as policies that have large gross budgetary effects. So gross budgetary effects are essentially if you take the line items on an individual budgetary estimate for a legislative proposal and you add up the absolute value of those line item provisions, so that if some changes are positive and some are negative, what you care about is the sum of the absolute value. Those are going to be the ones that are eligible for dynamic analysis in the US for CBO. So that rule has a certain logic. Large pieces of legislation are plausibly more likely to have substantial effects on productivity and employment. However, in practice, the major legislation rule, as currently designed, has resulted in the Congressional Budget Office only undertaking dynamic analysis for a budgetary estimate of a legislative proposal once since 2019. So this figure, which I hand-coded based on reading cost estimates or budgetary estimates from the Congressional Budget Office for the last 3 Congresses, estimates for the universe of the estimates from those 3 Congresses that empirically, there are very few legislative proposals that are even close to qualifying for dynamic analysis under the current major legislation rule, which is marked by the vertical line. So some people's initial reaction to this graph is to say, well, maybe we should shift that vertical line. But one point of hesitation there is that the one case that did qualify for dynamic analysis under the current major legislation rule was deemed by both CBO and JCT independently to have negligible macroeconomic effects in practice. And so as I will discuss, to me that raises the question of whether rules based on gross budgetary effects may be poorly targeted and whether we should consider different ways of targeting dynamic analysis. Doug Elmendorf touched on that targeting issue in his 2015 paper, noting even if the macroeconomic effects of a proposal with limited budgetary impact are small relative to the overall economy, by which he means they would never qualify for the major legislation rule based on their gross budgetary effects, their feedback effect on the federal budget could still be large relative to the non-macroeconomic budgetary impact of the proposal, by which he means if the dynamic effects are large relative to the conventional, what's included in a conventional estimate, that might be the right way of thinking about where dynamic analysis matters. And so he said, in those circumstances, careful dynamic scoring would significantly improve the accuracy of the budget estimate. He goes on to say, essentially, despite having that concern, and it's also notable that Doug was a Democrat-appointed CBO director, and this is generally, dynamic scoring is something that conservative lawmakers are more in favor of. So this paper was really, I think, an important contribution to the debate, showing that dynamic scoring shouldn't be a partisan issue. But he went on to basically say that from a practical perspective, feasible approaches to generating dynamic analyses on the timelines required by Congress, such as relying on maybe rules of thumb or kind of shortcuts, risk reducing the accuracy of CBO's estimates and diminishing CBO's credibility. And so that's kind of how he articulated his justification for the major legislation rule. So cut to today, 10 years later, Doug and Glenn Hubbard and I are now writing a paper that we will present and publish this fall, also with the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. And in a phrase that I admit I might have thought but never would have written myself, Doug, much to his credit, wrote, "We reach a different conclusion today." And so in our view, 3 factors have changed since his 2015 paper that have led us to reach that revised conclusion. So first is essentially that there's been technological progress in macroeconomic modeling since 2015. So CBO's modeling and experience producing macroeconomic estimates have improved considerably over the last decade. That progress has improved the quality of CBO's work in general, but in particular has meant that many of the macroeconomic complexities that a decade ago would have seemed intractably thorny to distill down into something that could be used by an analyst in a budgetary estimate on a short time horizon, actually now is quite reasonable to do. And we can produce high quality macroeconomic budgetary estimates on much shorter time horizons than we were able to before. Second, for 2 of the 3 examples that I'll discuss, high-skilled immigration and R&D investments, in my view, the strength of the evidence base in the academic literature has improved substantially over the past decade in a way that allows us to produce high-quality estimates in a way that we wouldn't have been able to 10 years ago. And third, while not widely appreciated before we hand-compiled that histogram that I just showed you, the major legislation rule, which was a rule which is intended to introduce more dynamic analysis into the US policy process for some legislative proposals, has effectively failed to accomplish that goal. And that's something that wasn't broadly known, but I think is actually quite important to remember that when we put rules in place that have an intention, it's important to go back to the historical record and to ask whether they're accomplishing the goals that they were laid out to accomplish. So building on the 3 examples that I'm going to discuss here, my paper with Doug and Glenn is reassessing the when of dynamic scoring in the sense of reassessing the appropriateness of the major legislation rule. So a natural, even if rough assessment of the major legislation rule proposed in Doug's 2015 paper is to ask how well targeted is that rule relative to the underlying phenomenon that it aims to measure. For various reasons, the 3 examples that I'll talk about today would essentially never qualify for dynamic analysis under the major legislation rule, even though they're likely to have budgetary effects that are quite different under dynamic analyses relative to conventional analyses. So drawing on those examples, our paper discusses potential alternatives to the major legislation rule that could better target dynamic analysis to cases where the excluded dynamic effects are large relative to the budgetary effects included in conventional analyses. So let me return to the example of high-skilled immigration so that I can illustrate some of the quantitative magnitudes involved and also illustrate budgetary estimates under some feasible alternative approaches. So the Congressional Budget Office, sometimes in collaboration with the Joint Committee on Taxation, has produced budgetary estimates of changes to immigration laws under 3 different approaches. First is the conventional approach, which, as I mentioned, holds the US population fixed at the baseline projection. The second is a fully dynamic approach, which again incorporates all of the effects on the economy and the federal budget that CBO expects would occur. That's been applied twice, although both as supplementary information rather than as part of an official budgetary estimate that's used in the formal budget process. And third, which requires more explanation, is an intermediate approach called the population change approach. So population change estimates reflect the behavioral responses included in conventional estimates, but also, so they just add in all of the direct budgetary effects of changing the number of people in the US population. And in particular, they add in the effects on taxable compensation and therefore on income and payroll tax revenues. However, population change estimates do not incorporate all of the effects on the economy that CBO expects would occur, which would be included in a fully dynamic approach. So one way of thinking about this population change approach is that I think of it as correcting an important asymmetry in how CBO conventional estimates are constructed for immigration proposals. So what does it mean to hold population fixed at the baseline projections? I think there's 2 natural interpretations. You could either hold fixed the population and exclude both outlays and revenues, or you could hold the population fixed but somehow include both outlays and revenues. But the current practice of including outlays, budgetary outlays, but excluding revenues is, in my view, extremely difficult to justify. CBO has shared a similar view. So in a 2015 report, when they were constructing budgetary estimates of a comprehensive immigration reform bill, this was referring to legislation from 2013. they applied the population change estimate approach in the official cost estimate for that legislative provision, and they give a very clear justification for that decision. So they articulated that holding the population fixed at the baseline projection would, in their words, imply that any employment of additional immigrants would be offset 1-for-1 by lower employment elsewhere in the US population. And they noted that outcome would be highly implausible, and went on to say that because of that, they chose to base their official budgetary estimate on this population change approach, which incorporated all of the direct effects on the US population, employment, and taxable compensation. So I realize that's a lot of words. In practice, all this is saying is that they added in the payroll and income tax revenues into that estimate. So going back to the legislative provision that I highlighted at the beginning, the Section 8303 proposal. So again, this is for green cards. It's lifting per country caps on the number of employment-based green cards that foreign nationals, STEM advanced degree holders, are able to use if they're interested in either staying in or moving to the United States. And so, and the cap exemption also applied to spouses and minor children. So in joint work with Matt Eschy and Jeremy Neufeld, we attempted to replicate this kind of population modeling that's sort of the first step of what the Congressional Budget Office needs to do in order to estimate the impacts of that kind of legislative provision. Basically, you want to understand how would that legislation affect the number and characteristics of individuals in the US population. The main thing I learned from that exercise is that CBO's job is really hard. So our starting point was recognition of the fact that an increase in the number of green cards made available by law doesn't translate in any straightforward way into a 1-for-1 change into the number of people in the United States. As one example, which I didn't know before we started that work, in 2022, 82% of US employment-based green cards went to individuals currently in the US and working, as opposed to individuals that would newly enter the US population. That distinction is extremely important because the budgetary and economic impacts of individuals adjusting status who may now have the option to stay in the United States for longer. They may have the opportunity to change jobs because they may have more flexibility to change employers, and they may be eligible for new federal benefits that they weren't on a temporary visa. But nonetheless, those budgetary and economic effects are quite different than the budgetary and economic effects of new individuals entering the US population. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to discuss this population modeling work in detail, but I just want to give one example of kind of the nuances that you need to take into account when you do that type of modeling. So this proposal uncapped a certain category of visas where a lot of people that would normally be that are newly eligible for that uncapped visa would have otherwise been in the United States on a capped visa pathway. And in particular, they would likely have been in the US on an H-1B visa, which is a capped visa pathway. And so someone who is then newly eligible to be on a green card could free up a slot on the H-1B visas for someone else who's not eligible for the newly uncapped green cards. And so all of those follow-through effects on spouses, expected sponsorship via family based pathways are things that you want to take into account in thinking about over the 10-year budget window what the total effects on the US population would be. So those kinds of population estimates feed directly into your ability to then generate budgetary estimates. And so again, this is the case I mentioned before where CBO estimated that that provision would cost the federal government about $3.1 billion over 10 years. So what Doug Elmendorf and I were interested in is how that budgetary estimate would have been different if it instead would have had the population change approach applied rather than the conventional budgetary estimates. You can glean some insight into that question from reading, as I did, all of CBO's historical budgetary estimates of immigration proposals. But Doug and I thought that a cleaner apples-to-apples direct comparison of a given legislative proposal being scored essentially both conventionally and through this population change estimate would make much more crystal clear for interested parties how much the technical choice of scoring methodologies matters in this case. So we approached Kent Smetters, I should say, at the time, neither Doug nor I was working at the Congressional Budget Office, so it's not like we can go ask CBO to generate these estimates. So instead, in place of that, we approached Kent Smetters and the Penn Wharton Budget Model Team, which is sort of an independent budget lab that produces budgetary estimates very analogous to the Congressional Budget Offices, and asked if they would be open to collaborating with us on that type of comparison. And very fortunately for us, Kent and his team agreed. I want to particularly thank Alex Arnon, who was the analyst on the Penn Wharton team that we worked with most most closely on this proposal. So this graph concisely summarizes the results of that work. The blue line is the conventional budgetary estimates over the subsequent 20 years. So the 10-year budget window would just be the first 10 years of that plot. The red line is the population change budgetary estimates over the same period. So over the 10-year budget window, a conventional approach suggests that this proposal would raise federal spending by about $4 billion. Similar in ballpark to CBO's estimates, although note that those aren't really comparable because they were in nominal terms at different times. In contrast, the population change approach, which again is just symmetrically including revenues as well as budgetary outlays, suggests that this proposal will result in a net decrease in the federal budget deficit of about $129 billion. When I did try to construct a comparison based on CBO's own past budgetary estimates and finding kind of similar legislative provisions, you actually get a very similar number if you do it via that approach. Over the following decade, so years 10 to 20, the difference is even larger, swinging from a $74 billion increase in the budget deficit under the conventional approach to a $634 billion decrease under the population change approach. And so, again, our goal with this work was to inform Congress and the public of how much the choice of budgetary methodology can matter, as at least for this particular legislative provision example, those two approaches obviously result in sharply divergent budgetary estimates. So of course, those population change estimates themselves only capture a subset of the budgetary channels that would be measured in a fully dynamic estimate. That wasn't a dynamic estimate, that was just this population change estimate. So in a paper published last week in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, authored by a large team of CBO staff members, CBO disclosed publicly that they're actively working on more fully dynamic models of the budgetary and economic impacts of immigration. And the work that I previewed at the beginning from the budgetary and economic outlook gives a framework of how they're analyzing things like productivity effects, for example, that were not included in the population change estimates that I presented. And we'll also mention a point that I'll come back to, which is that CBO also periodically posts calls for research on specific questions that are relevant to their work and service to the US Congress, including this one requesting more research on the question of how immigration affects productivity. So I'm going to speak much more briefly on two additional examples for government-funded R&D investments and permitting regulations governing the construction of physical infrastructure. For each example, I have some co-authored work in progress developing similarly dynamic budgetary estimates for representative legislative provisions with the goal of illustrating the quantitative magnitudes involved. And again, also illustrating feasible alternative approaches that capture more of the dynamic effects. Both of these examples build on a 2021 report that CBO published at the request of US Senator Robert Portman that illustrated how CBO would dynamically analyze spending on physical infrastructure. Interestingly, CBO, like most government agencies, has traditionally modeled research investments, or R&D, analogously to other forms of federal investment, such as physical capital. And so it's very natural to apply that framework both to federally funded R&D and to this permitting example of physical infrastructure. At a high level, the CBO report made, in my view, quite a large leap forward in kind of thinking through the conceptual issues of how you would construct a dynamic estimate for physical infrastructure investments. However, the report itself was, as best I know, never applied. So for example, it was never applied in a budgetary estimate for a given legislative proposal. That makes the report a very nice place for an outside researcher like me to pick up the modeling and think about how it could be applied in some specific use cases where I have some subject matter expertise to bring to the table. So given the time involved, I won't be presenting this work in nearly as much detail as the immigration example. And the most important points that I would like to make about these two examples are actually more conceptual points, although if we have time at the end, I would love to come back to talk some more about the specifics of the modeling. So first, the fact that I, as an outside researcher who had never worked at CBO or GCT or OBR or any of these organizations, was able to take CBO's publicly available 2021 infrastructure report and connect the dots of how to fit that model into CBO's other publicly available macroeconomic and budgetary feedback models itself illustrates a point that I tried to make earlier, which is that essentially a lot of technological progress has been made in the production function of budgetary estimates that, in my view, makes dynamic analysis much more feasible today than it was even a decade ago. So my sense is that even 10 years ago, the idea of this dynamic framework for physical infrastructure analysis being able to be distilled down and integrated into a streamlined process that could actually be applied by someone like me who literally knew nothing about budgetary estimates, with not that much time and effort, it can produce estimates of legislative proposals that are dynamic estimates on the timeline required by Congress. And that's only possible because of the substantial progress that researchers at CBO, and in particular from their macroeconomic modeling group, have made on developing models. Just to give a few examples, the budgetary feedback model and this associated rules of thumb spreadsheet, which you can download papers or tools for both of those on the CBO website. It is absolutely feasible for individual analysts with the equivalent of a master's in public policy to essentially compute these dynamic estimates in a spreadsheet on a short time horizon, which is what's being demanded currently in the congressional process. I realize that sounds incredibly in the weeds, but what I want to emphasize is that one of the two main arguments that people made about why we're not doing more dynamic analysis is because it's essentially too hard to do that on a practical timeline that works with the political process. And so I think it's just an opportune time to reassess whether that argument actually holds the water that it might have at some point in the past. The other main objection that people have historically had to dynamic scoring is that the available evidence base in the academic research literature is simply not sufficient to support the production of the relevant estimates. For the R&D case, as I'll discuss if we have time, I think there have been some key points of progress in the literature that do a lot to overcome that concern, which is one reason I think it's very timely and exciting to be opening the conversation about estimating a dynamic analysis of research and development investments as a use case. And so I'm excited to be working on that with three former CBO staff, Terry Gullo, Ben Page, and David Weiner. In contrast, for this permitting case, I actually completely agree that at the moment the literature, the academic literature is too thin to coherently support fully dynamic estimates at the moment. However, what I want to emphasize there is the word currently, and I want to highlight and encourage some of CBO's current efforts that I think themselves could do a lot to encourage the development of a more systematic evidence base here. So the process of working through what a dynamic analysis of changes to permitting regulations would look like, which I've been working on with Doug Elmendorf and Zach Liskow, who teaches at Yale Law School and is a JD PhD who's one of the leading scholars in the area, was for me incredibly helpful in clarifying what research questions we should be encouraging economic researchers to work on if the goal is to have estimates that can be of the key parameters that would be needed to do dynamic analysis in this space. So just to give a sense of what the conceptual issues are, in this case, changes to permitting regulations that affect federally funded or federally subsidized projects. So in the US, the classic example would be categorical exclusions under NEPA, the main kind of umbrella permitting regulation in the US. If those changes in regulations or legislation were effective, they would allow more infrastructure that is federally funded or federally subsidized to be built more quickly, which would just pull more spending into the 10-year window. And so consistent with that, if you read CBO's cost estimates or budgetary estimates of permitting provisions, they are assigned a deficit increasing budgetary score. However, if those are genuinely productive investments that you're pulling forward in time that have effects on total factor productivity in the economy, you would also be pulling forward those productivity effects in addition to the federally funded costs, which particularly if the costs are cost sharing on the federal side of private investment, as I'll come back to, those costs may be small relative to the productivity effects that you're pulling forward. Moreover, if shorter permitting delays encourage more private investment in infrastructure projects, that investment response would again be included, again with additional federally funded costs and any associated productivity effects for those incrementally funded projects. I realize that's a lot of words, but let me just give an analogy from my own work. So one of the papers that I most enjoyed writing in my career as a researcher was one where I asked for clinical trials. If you allow firms to conduct shorter clinical trials, would firms be willing to fund more clinical trials? And it turns out the answer is yes. And so there was a policy change in the US that basically cut dramatically the length of clinical trials. And it looks like firms were much more willing to invest in more clinical trials when they were shorter. We got more drugs developed, and patients' life years were dramatically saved. And so the question is, would we see a similar dynamic for permitting? So if we have shorter timelines to construct things, would there be an investment response where we would expect to see additional private investment in new projects, so that that would also be included in the budgetary estimates? So my preliminary back-of-the-envelope estimates with Doug and Zach suggest that for plausible parameter values, those productivity effects for at least some forms of investment are likely to be large relative to the cost factors that are included in conventional budget estimates. So the process of figuring out what parameter estimates we need but don't currently have requires doing something like that exercise, in the sense of doing enough work on the dynamic analysis to have a framework that can be used to clarify and articulate what the modeling bottlenecks are where more work and more research is needed. To me, this suggests that institutions like CBO, JCT, and OBR shouldn't wait to do dynamic analysis until the literature is ready. In contrast, in cases where there's reason to think that the excluded dynamic effects are likely to be quantitatively important relative to the effects included in conventional estimates, having some type of system that prioritizes this type of preliminary modeling effort and clarification of where further research is needed, I think would be incredibly valuable. There's then, of course, a natural question of how do you communicate that out to the research community, and kind of, not everyone is interested in having that guide their research priorities, but I think there's a number of economists that would be interested in that kind of information. And here I want to recognize and encourage several dimensions of work that the Congressional Budget Office is doing, many of which are analogous to activities at the IFS, that in fact has a much longer track record of doing many of these, that I think can do a huge amount to encourage academic research on these very policy relevant questions. So first are the types of public disclosures for calls for research that CBO included in that recent Journal of Economics Perspectives piece that I mentioned, or that they put out when they put out these calls for research on their website. I think those do a meaningful amount to draw attention to places where CBO has figured out that more research is needed on a given parameter value or question that might not be obvious to academics, even working in very closely related spaces. So just to give an example for permitting, almost no academics work on the types of permitting that are relevant to the US policy discussions. Even the very top people in environmental economics are often completely unaware of the discussions that are going on about permitting regulations. And so I actually think that CBO's disclosure of interest in certain questions around permitting have done a huge amount to encourage interest among academic researchers with the relevant expertise in those questions. Institutions like Paul Niehaus's Gradient Fund effort at UC San Diego are also now layering on financial support for researchers that are working on questions like those disclosed by the Congressional Budget Office. And just to give one example, one of the recent undergraduate students who I mentor read CBO's recent public disclosure of interest in permitting reform and is now writing a research paper on how changes in permitting regulations affect construction starts and economic growth, and has some quite interesting preliminary evidence that I won't discuss here today. But I don't think he would have been working on that project if it hadn't been for CBO framing a very sharply framed policy relevant version of that question. Second, in my experience, disclosing questions is helpful but less effective than directly teaching students and faculty and other researchers about what the day-to-day work of budget analysis is like, and letting them essentially collaborate on discovering and realizing what the gaps in the literature are relative to what's needed when you're doing policy relevant modeling. So CBO has long had what they call a visiting scholars program that allows faculty like me to visit unpaid and contribute to CBO's internal work. As a complement to some kind of more standard summer internship programs that they've long had, CBO recently started a dissertation fellows program more similar to the program that IFS has long had, that allows current PhD students to spend up to a year visiting CBO, contributing to CBO's work. So one of my PhD students is visiting CBO this summer and fall through that new program, and permitting is one of the topics that she's hoping to get a chance to contribute to, both to move the ball forward on CBO's work, but also for her to better understand how she might choose dissertation topics that are kind of genuinely trying to inform current congressional debates in the United States. Finally, it's not always the right fit to get researchers with the most relevant subject matter expertise to visit CBO for a prolonged period. But another example of what I think can be quite effective in this area is to have short, say, one-day workshops with the most relevant researchers in a given area, which I think serve two purposes. One is to effectively teach those researchers about CBO's or OBR's work on a given topic and have them be more informed consumers and discussion participants about those models. But it also gives outside researchers a chance to provide CBO with feedback, and it gives them a chance to see where more research is needed in order to inform the kind of modeling work that the budget agencies are doing. So just last week, I attended a workshop along those lines that the Harvard Business School hosted. Let me thank Bill Kerr for hosting, where CBO was presenting some of their immigration work. I personally found the discussion incredibly helpful in clarifying what the gaps were, where additional academic research was needed in assisting CBO with their modeling. And for permitting, one can imagine a similar workshop that would bring together economists, both from academia and outside, like Zach Liskow and Eli Dorado, for an analogous discussion. So let me say a few words, and then I will wrap up. So, and I can come back to some of these other examples if I have time later. So for decades, people have argued that, correctly, dynamic budget analysis can be really hard to do. But institutions like the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Office for Budget Responsibility, in practice, do dynamic analysis in various aspects of their work. And over the past few decades, I think these institutions have actually made enormous progress on the production function of dynamic analysis in a way that makes dynamic analysis much more feasible than it was even a decade ago. So high quality, comprehensive dynamic analysis provides more accurate and more comprehensive information to policymakers and to the public on the actual budgetary impacts of policy proposals. Moreover, the process of investing in dynamic analysis of topics where we think the excluded dynamic effects might be large relative to the effects included in conventional budgetary estimates can itself, I think, do a huge amount to clarify and spur additional academic research in areas where it's needed. As I said at the start, I realize that budget analysis to most people is a topic that you might think of as not the most exciting or kind of boring and arcane and mirrored in these very minute technical details. And again, I presume that's one reason why budget analysis has historically been neglected and not taught, for example, in public finance classes at a lot of universities. However, I see this as an area where the type of work that we do, bringing objective data and evidence, can provide meaningful information to policymakers and to the public about the implications of these seemingly small technical decisions about methodological scoring rules. The data and the analysis underlying those three examples that I talked about for high-skilled immigration, R&D, and permitting suggests the existence of systematic and recognizable disconnects between the estimated budgetary impacts that gets provided to policymakers and the actual budgetary estimates that we think would happen in practice. And again, I just want to emphasize that I think those disconnects matter because they affect which policies are getting invested in developing and also how those proposed policies fare in political debates. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. That was just absolutely fantastic and really relevant and important to the policy debates we're having in the UK today. Your permitting issue, I think, is very similar to the changes that the opposition here are thinking about in terms of planning reform, and they're doing it because they think it will have an impact on growth. And actually, obviously, including that in the forecast is going to be terribly important. Very recent example, the government extended free childcare to younger children in the budget last year, and they were, in a sense, able to do it because the OBR dynamically scored it, and I'll have a little boast here, on the basis of work that my colleagues at the IFS did on the impact that that would likely have on labour supply. So these are really important issues. Before I go to the audience, I'm going to abuse, as I always do, my position in the chair with one question. To what extent do you think there's a risk of this politicising the CBO, or in the UK the OBR, because there are different people who will have, whatever the evidence, as it were, very different views on this. I mean, we had very difficult experience here, as you will know, through Brexit and claims and counterclaims about economists being politically motivated in saying it might not be great for growth. The evidence is obviously clear. But there are also very big political. One thing you didn't talk about here was something that those on the right of politics will often claim, which is that lowering taxes will be very good for growth. So to what extent do you think there is a risk of politicization through using more of this kind of dynamic modeling?
Yeah, so the mandate of the Congressional Budget Office is to estimate the effects of policy changes, legislative changes on the federal budget. And in my view, dynamic analysis in service of that goal is not a political question. And so historically, Doug Holtz-Eakin, when he was CBO director, was asked to do a dynamic score of some tax proposals, and he reported back that the dynamic effects of those were small. And I have a lot of confidence that CBO's staff is very well qualified to rely on the academic literature and their judgment and their modeling in order to accurately provide budgetary estimates, as long as they're not constrained by the rules and precedents of the budget process to report something that's not an accurate estimate. The place where I think politics is more complicated, so in the US there's a separate agency, OIRA, which does cost-benefit analysis of different regulatory changes. And there you're not just estimating the budgetary effects, right? You're trying to estimate the costs and benefits and weight them up in some way that requires, like, a social welfare function. That's where I think the politics kind of comes in more, because you need to make in the end, political judgments about how you trade off the value of different things. So just to give one example for permitting, many of the permitting rules in the United States are about environmental protections. And so if I would have had more time, I would have gone into that in more detail. But so I think a very important question is, well, are the changes that are getting proposed in the permitting process having costs in terms of stripping away environmental protections that people might think are very important? So for the Congressional Budget Office, unless those are budgetary impacts, they're kind of out of mandate for the CBO, right? And so I think actually CBO's job is very narrowly tailored, so that that's not something that at least is first order in the cases that I've looked at. But in contrast, of course, other people care dramatically about the broader cost-benefit analyses, but there's other institutions that can do those analyses and have done those analyses, and those have fed into proposals for permitting changes to the permitting regulations that in many cases are trying to reduce permitting delays without having the associated environmental impacts. And just to give an example, there's many people that see that there, in the US system at least, is a lot of what they think of as wasteful litigation. And so that if you can kind of eliminate wasteful litigation in the process, you're actually not scrimping on any of the environmental benefits that you're getting, but you're rather just kind of eliminating some waste from the process. So this isn't my area. I don't want to make statements about whether I agree or disagree with those assessments, but what I'm saying is that for the Congressional Budget Office or for OBR, if the mandate narrowly is federal budgetary impacts, I don't see any reason why that should be a political discussion. And I realize that's at odds with the taxation debate that we had, but again, I think that's because people's normative views were kind of somehow creeping in to what the process is for producing accurate budgetary estimates. And so I think that it's important to keep the focus here on accurate, comprehensive budgetary estimates. More accurate estimates are more informative, and that shouldn't be a political decision.
Certainly shouldn't be. I couldn't agree with you more. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. I'll start with Rachel.
So Rachel Griffith from the IFS and from the IFS and the University of Manchester. So Heidi, thank you for a fantastic talk, and I thought it was very impressive, and I completely support what you're saying. One thing I was a bit surprised you didn't say anything about, though, was uncertainty. And so uncertainty both in the important behavioral parameters that are going to drive these results, but also in the state of the world in which they enact, that as we start projecting forward, those are the effects are going to depend on other things that may or may not happen, and we have to take a view. Does trade remain the same? Does what does climate change do? And those seem like they may be particularly important in some of these cases. And so how do you think about that in this setting?
Why don't you just take that one? That's quite
Sure.
a big one to take all
Yes.
by itself.
Yeah. So I will say that that's one of the classic arguments that people have made when they said, the research base is kind of not able to support is, do we have more uncertainty about the macroeconomic estimates relative to the conventional estimates? Just to bring up Doug Holtz-Eakin again as an example, he speaks publicly on his time at CBO more often, so he has more anecdotes to share. But, he often shares anecdotes about how much uncertainty is in so many of the conventional estimates that CBO needs to produce. And I think I've learned a lot from listening to him and also listening to others that it's just not at all clear to me that there's more uncertainty on average for the dynamic estimates than the conventional estimates. So one example that he shares is when he was CBO director, they were asked to provide a budgetary estimate for a death benefit to people in the US Armed Forces that were going to serve in the war in Iraq that hadn't yet started. And so we don't know what the scale of the war is going to be. We don't know what the casualties are going to be. There's not a lot of historical guidance that you have on modeling that. And so, yeah, we have uncertainty in many cases over the macroeconomic estimates, but like for the R&D example that I didn't go through in detail, I would say that there's roughly 3 papers that provide kind of reasonable estimates of the relationship between R&D and productivity. And let me say that Arnaud Devier, who is one of the job market candidates from LSE this year, has one of those papers. That's just a beautiful paper. They all give a pretty consistent picture, and I think I actually feel much more confident in kind of the range of estimates that's relevant for that than I do for Doug Holtz-Eakin's example of kind of that death benefit cost estimate that he needed to do. And so I think uncertainty is something that the Congressional Budget Office and OBR deal with all the time, and there's often debates about should they present ranges or point estimates. But I just don't see a strong case that this is so much worse for dynamic estimates than for conventional estimates. And so, yeah, that's kind of my current state of thinking.
Do you have a view about whether they should be presenting the uncertainty as opposed to the point estimates?
No, I can repeat views of others that have more experience in this area than I do. So Doug Holtz-Eakin, Doug Elmendorf often reflects on his time CBO director as saying he really wanted to present more information in ranges. And he's on the record saying he feels like that was essentially a failure because people just chose the part of the range that was most politically appealing to them. And in practice, it just didn't generate the benefits that he had kind of hoped it would. And so, I haven't followed the political process of budgetary estimates for long enough to have my own opinion, but I learned a lot from hearing his reflections on thinking that was important and then in practice feeling like it was harder to accomplish the goal that he wanted. So,
people don't like ranges, of course. They like certainty at the front here.
Mohammed Amin, retired PwC tax partner and politics junkie. My question is similar to Paul Johnson's, but not quite the same. I'm a great supporter of dynamic sort of calculation in this context. My question is, from your observation, do congressional Democrats and congressional Republicans hold the CBO in equivalent regard? And are they both equally supportive, or is there a difference in supportive in their doing more dynamic modelling?
Interesting question. We'll take a couple. Who else had their hand up? Joseph, then. No, there's one at the back there, and then Joseph.
Hi, I'm Ollie Bartram, an economist from the Institute for Government think tank here. Thanks for a great talk. I think there are lots of lessons we in the OBR could learn from your research. I guess one of the common challenges that you identified with the CBO that the OBR definitely faces as well is having to do analysis in a really, really short time frame. So the budget timetable in the UK will mean that the OBR has potentially a couple of weeks to look at the dynamic effects of a very, very large number of policies. So I was really interested in your point about how advances in modelling can improve the efficiency. So I wondered if I could ask you to get a little bit further into the weeds about what characteristics of CBO models or modelling capabilities within the CBO really have led to those efficiency improvements. Thanks.
You got a third question? From here.
Hi, thank you. Joseph Lowe. I look after the Green Book in Her Majesty's Treasury. Man at the front took me on to do it in 2006. Thank you, John. It's been great. But I'm soon going to leave the Treasury, so I'm going to say something a little bit daring, but not too daring. When you're inside the machine of any government, you know, you have to serve the people who are elected, because that's the democratic deal. And they bring to it their own framing of the world and their own view. And that may not be as up-to-date or as informed as you are in this brilliant presentation, which I thank you for immensely, and hope that there'll be some kind of published summary or paper of it at some point, because I think it's tremendous stuff. And we really do need independent organisations like the IFS and like academics to do this research. It's very, very valuable. But there are two things. One is, when ministries have got their finance ministry hat on, then they're being accountants, and it's terribly important to balance the budget that year, or say that you can anyway. But when they've got their economics ministry hat on, they're very interested in things like risk, and there's a sort of culture clash between the finance ministry and the economics ministry thing here. And that's very important to understand, as well as the tremendous investment that there is in public perceptions of how the economy works and everything else, which may be years out of date in terms of how we actually believe it works and what we can actually think about now. So all that is a tremendous drag on this development. And the interface between what economists on the inside do and what economists on the outside do in the public debate inevitably transforms across that divide from what is and what is not political on a political basis. And folks like me have to keep a million miles away from that while being actually quite politically aware. That's the deal.
Is there a question here?
Yeah, so the question is, how can we foster a more restrained but intelligent debate which is divorced from the drag factors of these differences in culture and the heavy investment that there is, often a political investment, in misconceived views of how the economy works?
Right, so how can we get the population and politicians to understand better how this really works? Quite a political question about, you know, views of Democrats and Republicans on the CBO, and what about the speed at which all this has to be done?
Great, so let me comment on those in order. So I think it's really hard to ask what Democrats and Republicans' views on dynamic scoring are, because it's been just completely dominated by the tax example. And so, you know, at least in the US, people think that they know their views because of the debate that they've heard about dynamic scoring of tax changes. That's one reason why Doug Emundorf and I were really interested to work on proposals of multiple different areas, because I think it's important that this not be seen as an issue for taxes, and people have opinions and policy positions on taxes, and then the question about dynamic analysis somehow comes down to, how do you feel about taxes? And that's not what we should be talking about. What we should be talking about is a broad portfolio of examples where there's reason to think, based on the academic literature, that the dynamic effects may be important. And if you look at the portfolio of examples that I chose, it includes issues that are primarily supported by Democrats and some that are primarily supported by Republicans. And so I think this shouldn't be perceived as kind of a one-sided issue, but that it's hard to assess right now just because the conversation has been so focused on just one issue in the past. Let me take the third question next. So in the United States, the Congressional Budget Office is part of the legislative branch rather than the executive branch. And that really shapes, I mean, that was very intentional, and it shapes how they think about kind of the role that they play. Their job is to inform Congress, and their people that they work for are the congressional budgetary committees. And so a lot of the things that the Congressional Budget Office does have a mirror that's done in the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the executive branch. And you know, I don't think anyone thinks it's wasteful that that's done twice, because CBO's work is often seen as less partisan and more credible on kind of key important topics. And so I think CBO as an institution has just done a remarkable job of retaining like an incredibly strong reputation for rigorous nonpartisan analysis. And I think that's just something that is hard to build and easy to lose, and it's pretty amazing actually that they're just celebrating their 50-year anniversary, that it's been so consistent, that they have been so well respected. I do think that nonetheless, that doesn't mean that they have all of the right incentives and they're kind of doing everything right. And so one reason that I'm really excited about the work that Penn Wharton, or for example, the Brookings Urban Tax Policy Center does in these kind of independent budget labs is they have the opportunity to explore things that CBO as an agency are not being asked to do by their budget committee, the oversight committees that they have. They can try out things and see what matters, and that can provide information that CBO may not have the time or mandate to explore. And so I think the idea of kind of how can we as outside researchers and outside independent budget institutions generate information that spurs kind of different conversations to be had, I think is a really important role for us to think about how we can support them in their very important work. I would love to talk about the details of the guts of the model. So let me give you a few examples, but it's just to say for both the government-funded R&D case and the permitting case, I run the risk of offending the macroeconomists that work at the budget agencies when I say this, but I was essentially able to distill down a dynamic analysis into a spreadsheet that I can work through in not a large amount of time with someone with the equivalent of an MPP degree who has subject matter expertise and experience in a given topic area, and they can generate dynamic estimates very quickly for those proposals that, in my opinion, are quite similar in quality to what CBO would produce if they were kind of using a full model. So let me give kind of a few examples of that. So historically, CBO kind of had a short-term model for macroeconomic effects that was more focused on supply and demand, and they had a more like long-term solo growth model, and those were kind of separate, and they didn't connect very naturally, and there was some inconsistency on how the estimates from the short-term model got passed through to the long-term model. At some point, they developed these integrated models, and so actually the short-term model and the long-term model are kind of connected together. Those are important for both policy analysis and forecasting of kind of more complicated legislative proposals. But for the physical infrastructure report that I cited, they actually didn't need to use those models. What they did is they built this infrastructure model that's described in the report in a way that could be distilled down just into the minimal number of macroeconomic variables that could be fed directly into what they call their budgetary feedback model. And so you don't need to use these intermediate policy models or the forecasting models to generate what you need to understand the budgetary impacts. So that budgetary feedback model is something that is, again, like a real step forward in terms of like what's possible, but then they further distilled that down into something they call the rules of thumb spreadsheet, which is for 4 key variables. They just have a spreadsheet, so you can kind of play around with different estimates. So, of particular interest here is if the productivity, effect is X, what's the budgetary flow through of that? And so it turns out that that's calibrated every year to match what the budgetary feedback model would produce. And so if you have proposals which can be distilled down into that minimal set of macroeconomic variables, it's literally just a spreadsheet. And so the thing I want to avoid is we would never be happy if we were starting with a spreadsheet, right? We would have no confidence that that was like a reasonable interpretation. The only reason that it makes sense to even think that that's a plausible thing is because we know that it's meant to match these much more complicated technical models that CBO has developed over time. And so I want to be clear that the goal here is not to reduce the quality of the estimates. The goal here is to leverage the fact that we've made these enormous investments in a way that can actually be distilled down in kind of more simplified ways that give us confidence when they match kind of the more complicated model estimates that we're not having a reduction in quality, even though we can produce things on a shorter time horizon. And so it's just, as someone who didn't know where everything was buried on the CBO website, I was doing a bunch of things by hand and I was explaining how I was trying to do something, and they're like, we have a spreadsheet that just like does that for you. And I was like, no, I didn't know that, But it's really like these are tools that they produce that are just not getting applied in the context where, like you said, in the US it's similar. They often have 2 weeks on average to produce these budgetary estimates, right? And oftentimes it's shorter, for the immigration legislation that Congress was debating in February, I think, in conjunction with the Ukraine aid. I think the legislative text came out on Sunday night, and there was kind of a question of, is that going to be ready, for a vote in a few days, And it's just, you can't do a complicated macroeconomic model on that time horizon. But if you have kind of the tools ready for given areas which are of legislative interest, I think this is actually quite feasible to do even on those very compressed time horizons.
Thank you. Last round, Gus, John, and person in front of John. So start with Gus and then John.
Thanks very much. That was brilliant. Love it. Two things. I started off thinking about, so obviously better budgetary scores will be better, no question. But it would be great to see examples of policy failures as a result of wrong budgetary things. Now, you implied it, but it wasn't quite there. But the second part that kind of, the more you talked, the more I thought about was, does this mean that we're giving excessive weight to budgetary impacts in policy analysis? Because, there's the CBO, as you said, there's a lot on that, but actually a lot of policies have impacts that are far beyond budgets, and they may get less weight because nobody's making any numbers on them. So does that worry you that this is going to have too much weight on just purely public finance numbers?
Thanks, Heidi. That was John Van Reenen from the LSE. That was terrific. I really enjoyed it. And what really struck me, or one of the things which really struck me, was the read across from so many of the issues and the examples you gave. And Paul mentioned infrastructure, skilled immigration. Think of the debates we're having over universities and foreign students here. Really important. So one question I had, and maybe one request. The question is that. What countries do you think, have you come across, do this well or better than you've seen, say, from the US or the UK? Because it strikes me that, so many, this is an opportunity, and this is the request, for other countries and other places to adopt the type of technologies and methodologies you're developing in order just to make the budgetary process much better in a range of different countries. So, there's a kind of, you're an evangelist for doing it in the US, you're spreading it, technological diffusion to the UK. But I'd like to see this more, at a global level, because I think it's such important work. Thanks.
Thank you. Richard Williams, I'm at PwC, but I used to be at the Treasury and I used to do costings, so I agree with everyone else. This is fascinating, really interesting stuff. One question that occurred to me as we were going through it is that we were looking at policies here that have positive economic impacts and are intended to have positive economic impacts. Just interested in sort of your reflections on what the challenges might be where there are policies that may have negative impacts, and how those might both be measured, but also how you ensure that they are fed into the process, which I think would be a challenge in the kind of UK dynamic.
Yeah, so let me take the last one first. So the Fiscal Infrastructure Report takes as a parameter what is the productivity effect for that particular kind of physical infrastructure investment. And when they did the report, they were relying on the academic literature, which is mostly for highways, and in particular, mostly for highways during a very specific time period during the 1960s. And those parameter estimates are probably not at all representative of the vast majority of physical infrastructure investments that people are thinking about. So for example, for the permitting case in the United States, one of the recent exemptions to NEPA, the permitting kind of umbrella regulation in the US, was for the semiconductor fabrication facilities that were trying to onshore through the CHIPS and Science Act. And so there were federal subsidies for those, and they wanted them to be built quickly, so they were having permitting exemptions for those. So do we think that that productivity estimate has anything to do with highways in the 1960s? No, right? So, but the nice thing about this is that, the productivity estimates are just specific to this kinds of investment. And in the same way that I talked about this virtuous cycle of kind of policy development presumably benefits from more feedback on kind of like which policy proposals achieve a given legislative goal most effectively at any given budgetary estimate cost. the more that we can do to provide evidence from the economic literature on the productivity effects of different kinds of federal investments, the more that we can have information to better align, what kinds of physical infrastructure do we think have the largest productivity effects. And so that's something where I think the main constraint there is the academic literature. It's not that CBO missed kind of some major set of reports, but there also are glimmers of progress. Like I said, they use that framework to think about R&D, but actually the last time that CBO publicly wrote on R&D was, 10 or 15 years ago, and actually the literature progressed a huge amount since then. And so, I think there's real opportunities for doing better. I will say that I woke up in the middle of the night, at some point during the last year when I was working on this, and realized a version of your other point, which is dynamic scoring is symmetric. So for the immigration debate, when we have restrictions on immigration, we are also reporting budgetary estimates of those restrictions that are not well aligned with the true budgetary impacts. And so I had just never thought about that before, because of course, again, the tax discussion is always focused kind of on thinking about growth effects. But yeah, in the same way that CBO's estimates are that the immigration surge is increasing revenues and increasing productivities, what that would imply is if we were generating accurate dynamic scores, then effects to curb the surge, which many people are interested in, should receive kind of an opposite signed budgetary estimate from what they're currently receiving. And so I think that's quite important, but in some sense, correct dynamic scoring automatically accounts for that. And so, but I do think it's quite important. Okay, on the first question, so the incredibly overly US-focused example that I tried to highlight at the beginning was trying to give an example of a policy failure. And so the idea was there's this provision for high-skilled immigration in the US that's very focused on researchers that are needed to contribute to the Defense Department, the defense industry. It's actually quite interesting. There's a recent paper by Jason Matheny, who's the head of RAND, who's worked a lot in national security, and Amy Nice, who's an immigration lawyer, that's kind of telling the political economy history of how that provision kind of came into play. So the US Department of Defense has a very holistic view on how they think about the value of foreign nationals. So they're a huge share of their workforce. But not just by workforce. They don't just mean people employed by the Department of Defense or funded on Department of Defense contracts. They are of the view, which has been stated across administrations, that in the industries that are critical to national defense and national security, actually just those industries' presence in the US, regardless of whether it's touched by any federal funding, is something that strengthens kind of national defense and national security prerogatives. And so these provisions for green cards that are needed in defense critical industries are not tied to being employed by like a Department of Defense contractor. It's just researchers in AI, researchers in semiconductors, researchers in biomedical research areas. And so it's quite interesting to look at the history politically of those provisions, and they're coming up through the National Defense Authorization Act, which is this legislative bill that's meant to be kind of a must-pass political bill. The Department of Defense, 16 agencies, have the flexibility to have these green cards, but the provision dropped out because of the CBO score. So if the political process wasn't supportive of those additional green cards, I think that's one thing. But if the reason that provision genuinely dropped out is because the budgetary estimates that were reported by CBO were inaccurate, I think that's much more concerning. And so, that's the sharpest example I've run across of these policy failures, but I'm sure there's other ones that I would learn about if I kept working on other case studies. Your question about are budgetary estimates getting excessive weight in the political process, I think, is really important. And the more that I talk to people that have kind of a long view of the budgetary process, at least in the US, which, CBO, like I said, they're just celebrating their 50-year anniversary. So there's kind of a lot of reflection going on, whereas OBR is obviously much, much newer as an institution. Yes, people are concerned that CBO scores were never intended to be used in the way that they're getting used right now. They were meant to be one input into kind of a menu of a discussion of kind of different ways in which we could think about the trade-offs from policies. That's of course not CBO's fault, right? The political discourse has evolved and decided to use those scores in a certain way. how you walk back from that, or whether people decide to walk back from that, I don't know the answer to that. But, and obviously, I'm relatively new to this area, so I'm mostly reflecting back at you things that I've heard from people that have a longer term view of this. But yeah, I think a lot of very thoughtful people are concerned about how they're getting used in the political process. And then, yes, on John's question. So one of my mentors on kind of policy topics is David Wessel, who's at the Brookings Institution in DC, and I told him I was coming to give this talk, and he said, "You can't go to the UK and talk about CBO all the time, Heidi." And so, and indeed, I really appreciate Richard Hughes from OBR and John Van Reenen both gave me some comments on my talk, but I actually had not fully appreciated the many parallels actually between the immigration case in the US and the UK before I came here. And honestly, all of the issues around student visas, all of the issues around student work authorization, stay rates of students, like these are actually quite analogous. And I've been thinking a lot about the US case and not about the UK case. Similarly, yeah, the politics of permitting are different in the two countries, and so I think maybe that's a little bit less so. But there's obviously been a lot of renewed interest in government funding of research here in the UK, because there's been just a lot of recent policy movement on that front too. And the conceptual issues for the permitting, I think, are more similar than the political context might suggest on first glance. So I learned a lot from learning more about that. I know there's a structure where OBR and CBO and other countries in the OECD kind of regularly meet to share kind of learnings on how they're doing modeling and things like that. CBO is not the oldest budgetary institution. I think the Netherlands is the oldest. But I think those are meant to be a forum for kind of sharing these things. It's something that I appreciate the opportunity to have reflected on some of the parallels with the UK case, and I think for me personally, that's going to inform my own work going forward. So.
Well, look, that was really inspiring, I think, for all of us, particularly those of us here who do spend all of our lives working on these budgetary issues, and the dynamic effects of them are desperately important. We at the IFS will clearly be doing a lot of this over the next several months as we run up towards an election where lots of dubious claims will no doubt be made on both sides, both without the dynamics, but also about the dynamics, and we'll certainly be working on that. I think it is really important what you're saying for getting economic policy right, and I thought the question about actually the education of the policymakers and the electorate in all of this is absolutely crucial as well, as is the trust in the people who are making these judgments, and that again is a place where I think we at the IFS play an incredibly important role, as does the OBR, as do all of you. Heidi, thank you so much. Everybody will say thank you to Heidi in a second, but there are drinks outside. This is the one time in the year where the IFS gives away free drinks, I think. So do make the most of it. Talk to my colleagues and old friends here. Thank you so much for coming, and please do keep looking at everything that we do, and indeed that Heidi does. Thank you, Heidi.